Japan wins, right? So this is a really big moment, and we talked about this in class. As I mentioned before, the Japanese are victorious at sea, and they are victorious ultimately on land, but not by a lot. And as we also discussed, the terms of the victory that are hammered out at Portsmouth are favorable to the Japanese in terms of getting all the Russian holdings and getting half of Sakhalin and having supremacy in Korea, but they don't get this much waited for indemnity. So I want to get to that again right away. In the right place here. What you can't see is, well, that's what it says, incomplete victory. So this victory, it seems like it was a Japanese victory, and so people in Japan were looking forward to the spoils of a victory. So here we can see a welcome home troops arch in Hiroshima, one of the major manufacturing and training facilities for the Japanese army. So they were looking forward to that. And when across the country, but also across the world, we see an increased recognition of Japanese military prowess and their advanced level of civilization. This was sort of them being able to say that they had arrived, and the West seemed to agree. The Japanese took good care of their prisoners, which wasn't the case so much in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 1895, and this was well known. The treatment of wounded soldiers was also given a lot of attention in the press in Prussia, now becoming Germany, but also in the United States and Great Britain. Nurses who had trained in Japan using a lot of American and French standards were also, just on display and doing a good job taking care of the wounded. In terms of the actual confrontation, we already had, in 1904, we already had English language publications pointing out that Japan was actually winning this fight against the much bigger and obviously more advanced Western country of Russia. Here we can see Japan knocking out Russia. I couldn't find the paper on this one, but another one that we also could see at the time was this is a Japanese housewife who is doing some canning, and she's canning the Russian fleet here at Port Arthur. So putting them in, keeping them in because there was a big siege that ends up helping them to win the war. And this was actually published in the Tacoma Weekly or Tacoma something like Tacoma Times. I think it was Tacoma Times. So west coast of Japan that had a good view on what's happening in East Asia. All of this good news also helped to sort of justify the sacrifice the Japanese were making to fight this war. The casualties on Japan's side were 75,000 soldiers, and we can add to that lots of people also who are impacted by the loss of livelihood or the loss of people to help work on farms back home. So this is just a death toll number. This is compared to the losses of about 25,000 on the Russian side. So a costly victory in so many ways, right? One of the most interesting aspects of Japanese media at this time was its ability to report on victory all the time, even little ones, but not to report on losses or stalemates. So we end up with the Japanese populace ready for a big pot of gold at the end of this victory, of this sacrifice and this war. And on top of that, there's also just an unprecedented sort of surge in patriotism. We see shrines holding big celebrations to welcome home troops and to celebrate victories throughout this short but obviously devastating war. And overall, we see that there's an increase in patriotism. This actually goes back to about 1894-95 with the Sino-Japanese War. A great increase in Japanese sort of national identity and pride in their country, definitely being encouraged by educators and government officials, philosophers. It's across the spectrum, and we'll discuss more a bit later in class about how this develops. But this was a sort of a unique and new forward patriotic momentum that took shape from 1894 all the way through 1905. So they're aware of their identity as Japanese. They're aware of their great national and ethnic traits. They're aware of their sort of uniqueness more than ever before in terms of this the times rhetoric. And so they were looking forward again to a big victory. But there was basically no identity. So all that fighting and no cash reward afterwards. This, had it been any Western country, would have been like unfathomable, right? Such war, and even after a stalemate, a victory would be followed by the ability to force the losing side to pay a lot of money, as Japan had done with China before. But this is not happening. Roosevelt cannot get Russia to accede to this, and they don't actually sort of go that far. So what's happening also in all the reporting and the increased newspaper circulation and the victories and the promoting of patriotism and national identity is people in Japan are also more aware of how they're tied together. More aware that people from all over Japan are part of the same country, and they're even more and more in contact. And this works for being patriotic and trying to raise national sentiment and loyalty to the emperor and service to the country, but it also serves to allow people to communicate about discontent, right, and about frustration. The Hibiya riots that break out as soon as the news of the Portsmouth Treaty are announced are evidence of that. These riots take place over 3 days at Hibiya Park. And here we can see, it's probably hard to see in the old picture, but this is a car that is being shaken. And you can see people have their hats off. They're really PO'd. So what's happening here? The protests take place in Hibiya Park. This is a park. It is a modern public park that was created in 1903 to be sort of to symbolize Japan's modern nature and to help show the best sides of Tokyo. In the sort of model of Olmsted and other famous park makers in the world, the one who made Central Park. We have these. This is an effort to be along, to bring Japan alongside those other kinds of projects in terms of urban development. Here we can see a map of this area of Tokyo, and if we look here, we see Hibiya Park. Looking at this little slice of the map, what things can you notice about the location of this park? Drew, yeah?
The Imperial Palace.
Yeah, right, that's the most striking and important element here. This is the Imperial Palace, right? This is where the emperor is. And it's also, because of how Tokyo is structured, it's also the place where a lot of things that are tied to the imperial authority are located, right? We see, yeah, Stephen?
It looks like the political district almost, because you have the home ministry residence, you have the foreign minister, the police. It's a lot of the governmental assets are right next to that park.
Yeah, right. So exactly, right. So the Imperial Palace becomes sort of the focal point for the establishment of the embassies from other countries, of the military, of the government offices like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or Home Ministry. This area over here, this is an area called Kojimachi, and down here an area called Bansho. This area here is where all of the Imperial Diet members have their homes. And the Diet is actually located just over, where are we at? Yeah, just kind of over here, right? So this is an area that has all that right in it, right? A walking distance, a stone's throw, so to speak. And this park is there. So when the emperor wants to come watch the parade of the Imperial Army on their horses as they do their parade, right? They do that in this park. when there are huge events that are going to happen that are going to be nationally important for the government. They have them in that park. And so people then also choose this park to protest. As we just said, that's where it's located. Protesters were angry because of what they thought was an unfair deal that was negotiated on their behalf by their government. A government which, as we may recall again, right, is led by people who are not elected, but then those who are elected are only elected by 2% of the men of voting age in Japan. So lots of levels, right, of undemocratic, in their view, representation. And they gather in the park because they are trying to make sure that their voices are heard by the emperor as well as by the rest of the country. And the clashes that happen in Tokyo then spread out through almost all of Japan's prefectures. So the hurt and the frustration is not just about Tokyo, it's a national problem, it's a national protest movement that takes shape. And the government has to then declare martial law for the first time across Japan to respond to this. In the end, there's not a high death toll, only 17 deaths. A lot of buildings are burned, and there are hundreds of arrests. The buildings that are burned are oftentimes those tied to the government. So we have police boxes, koban, we have mayor's offices, we have conscription offices. These kinds of sites that are targeted by these protesters. Between having themselves fought and having seen their sons go off to war, or sometimes their husbands go off to war, the people of Japan as a whole thought that they'd given enough for this war. It didn't have at all the results that they were promised in the media and by the government. And on top of that, they also were aware that there was no clear way for them to have their voice heard. This was not a popular democracy. This was not a majoritarian democracy that they were taking shape in. I want us to think about the Meiji period as a pretty incredible and actually long period in Japan's history. The Meiji emperor died in July of and it was a major national event, right? This is the time the country was in deep mourning. His health was being reported on in the papers every day. His illnesses were being reported on, and he was, when he made progress and was feeling better, that was also reported on. A lot of media attention, and perhaps for Japan, like the first sort of mass media moment of modern Japan's history was this, the emperor's illness and death. So it really brings to an end this modern period where Japan transitions from being a somewhat feudal, early modern, centralizing state to being a really modern, Western style country, part of a global order, unlike ever before. And it was a major event. As we can see here, a big element in this will be the Shinto priest here in the front. And there are Shinto sort of icons all throughout the ceremony that is taking place. Here we have more Shinto imagery as well. The whole country was tuned into this, so to speak, although there were not easy ways to hear about this yet available to all. So looking back on the Meiji period, so this is 1868 to 1912. I had you in your exams to think back on some of these sort of long-term trends that had taken place over the course of Japan's history from 1500 or so up until 1912. Let's take a second and talk about a few of these things. So looking back from 1912, looking from there backwards, if someone asked you, how would you describe the history of Meiji Japan in like a sentence or two? Like, what are some key themes that you would definitely want to bring out to your, like, maybe less informed friend? Things that describe Japan's development, its trajectory over this long period of time. Yeah. Nick?
Rapid westernization.
Westernization, right? A very big theme that we see, right? And one that perhaps we probably hadn't foreseen that looking back to Japan in the early modern period, right? So a very big shift there. Yeah, definitely. Other themes that you see defining this, the Meiji Emperor's reign from 1868 to 1912. Other things that might encapsulate this for a friend who doesn't know much about Japan. How about, let me ask that differently. What things about Japan's history so far in the Meiji period have been like surprising to you that you hadn't sort of foreseen before you came to this class? Evelyn? Okay, so like the people trying to sort of find a voice in politics, trying to have more say in things, and claim their rights has been surprising to you. This is really it's a huge theme, right? Japan all of a sudden has all of this popular political activism. It actually doesn't go away, even though Japan will, I would say, shift much more away from democracy in many ways. This current, it sort of persists. Yeah. Other things that surprised you in the Meiji period, yeah. Wesley?
The speed of industrialization.
So the speed, right? It's very rapid, right? Across the world, countries are industrializing. Japan is not unique in that, right? But what is interesting is how quickly this happened, right? And throughout Japan, not just in major cities. And that also has consequences too, right? But this is it's impressive to see that happen, and it's surprising as well. Other themes that are things that you found surprising looking back now that we're in 1912. Okay. So looking from now 1912 onwards, what do you think is going to be the future of Japan based on what you know from other sources, but also what you've read so far? Like what's next for Japan? What the Meiji Emperor has died. What is the new era for Japan going to look like? We're going to have more, I don't know, or less or something. Jonah.
Looking outwards beyond Japan.
Okay, looking outwards in terms of not just ideas, but also actual territorial expansion, right? This thing we're actually going to do a bit today. So a very astute insight, definitely, yeah. What else is next for Japan? This is a zone I haven't heard from here. What's next for Japan? Are they going to revolutionize something? Are they going to do anything? We talked about expansion. Like, what else is in Japan's future? I mean, you probably know a bit about what's in the future, but so what do you foresee? Tariq?
Them like coming to the world stage, kind of, and being.
Right. So the idea of expansion as well, but also the idea of Japan becoming one of the great powers, right? Japan will join the G5 eventually, right, and become one of these top industrial powers post-war period. So this is Japan's future. It's definitely, so to get there, we'll have to see how that happens. It's definitely going to happen. So Japan will shake off the unequal treaties and will become, or hopefully become, equal to Western countries of that sort of the similar economics, industrialization. Are we going to see more Westernization, or are we going to see a shift away from that? What do you think? Embracing the West even more? Away, yeah, Eric said that. So I think we're going to see a very complicated future on that topic, right? Definitely going to see a change from the Meiji period there as well. So let's see how all these things sort of play out. So the Meiji period ends in 1912. It's the beginning of the Taisho period, which lasts from 1912 to 1926. This is a period we'll talk about next class more, but I want to talk today about empire. One of the things that defines the Meiji period looking back is Japan's rapid race towards empire. It didn't happen all at once, but it does happen. These sort of, 68, 1912, these like 45 or so years are the sort of foundation for Japan's empire, which I should get to that. I want to mention one last thing, and that is that when the Meiji Emperor died, he was followed into death not long afterwards by General Nogi Marasuke, who was a very important general for the Meiji military. He was in the Imperial Army, and then he had risen through the ranks. He was very important in the Satsuma Rebellion, which we'll discuss that a bit today. He fought impressively in the Sino-Japanese War, which we'll discuss that next class. And he also fought courageously in the Russo-Japanese War as well. So he was a war hero known throughout the country. The most famous, among the most famous generals, right, in Japan in 1912. And he had been part of the modernization of Japan's military as well, from the French sort of training period up through the later Prussian influence period of the early 1880s. And he also became the Governor General of Taiwan in the 1890s as well. So he's someone who has just basically been very visible. And what you'll have a hard time seeing because of the zoom box is that he committed ritual suicide with his wife, Suzuko, in September of 1912. He chose to do this because he felt that he had failed the emperor in some ways. He thought he'd lost too many lives in the Russo-Japanese War. It was a victory overall for Japan. But he also believed that it was the end of an era, that he was not going to be able to continue to serve the country without the emperor that he had served most of his adult life, right, at the helm. So this speaks to the importance of the emperor as a symbol, but also as a sort of an object of loyalty, right? Suzuko and Marasuke here were, again, very visible figures. And this suicide, ritual suicide, or seppuku, was very heavily as well sort of publicized or mediatized as well in Japan's media, because it was sort of a moment of convergence, or perhaps somewhat also confusion between old Japan, so to speak, of Bushido and of Junshi, or following your leader into death. This seems to contradict in many ways with sort of the modern Japan that was being built, right? That was even more against this practice than the shogunate had been. So it was a moment of, again, thinking back to Japan's past and previous practices and traditions, and how those are going to play out in this new modern period in Japan. So 1912, Emperor Meiji and many others, but also General Nogi, die, and this is the beginning of the Taisho period. So from Meiji to Taisho. Taisho period lasts from 1912 to 1926, named after the Taisho emperor, right? Who is the son of the Meiji emperor. Even more than his father, the Taisho emperor was, he had some mental health issues and probably some handicaps, and so it looks like, looking back, it does seem that he was not able to exercise his duties as emperor fully, right? And so, even more than before, we see the prime minister really having the most control. Only on one occasion do we see this sort of challenged, and as I'll discuss in a bit, this is hugely problematic when he tries to use his authority. So I'm going to use this old list again, but if we start from sort of from here, we see Kato Taro and Sayonji Kinmochi these two figures essentially are going to be prime minister off and on for a long time, going back and forth. And it is they who will sort of oversee this transition to the Taisho period. And it begins actually with a crisis. So Prime Minister Saionji, 1912, still kind of trying to deal with the sacrifices of 1905 and around that time period and other issues that are going on, trying to avoid problems of inflation. He proposes military spending cuts. Japan's not fighting a war right now, so that should be fine, right? The army minister then decides that this is terrible, and resigns. The problem is that the cabinet has to have an active member of the army as minister to be a full cabinet, and the army refuses to assign anyone to that role. So when the cabinet cannot function, the prime minister obviously is lacking the confidence of the cabinet, and so he essentially has to step down. So what we see here is that the army, which is not at all part of the structure of the government, right, is able to withhold the minister and therefore begin to, in a sense, indirectly dictate policy. The new prime minister that is appointed by the Diet is Katsuro Taro, who we see here. He was prime minister in the first years of the 20th century, and so he has experience, and I thought he would be, a good person to turn to. He is also a former member of the army, a general of the army, so he has credentials that they believe would be useful in trying to fix this problem. And this goes back to your question also, Zach, of why are they always changing and who's going to come in? He was someone who was viewed as a good solution because he had ties to the army. He could make them sort of get in line. The Navy, on their end, were worried about the army having preference, so they make a request for a budget line to allow them to build more battleships. Again, Japan not at war at this time, not invading anywhere at this time, and they have a free hand in Korea. This is a what-if scenario, but they asked for this warship, and it is refused by the new prime minister, and the Navy then does, on their end, withholds a minister from the cabinet, again forcing a situation in which the cabinet cannot do its job and the government cannot rule. So we have, again, an impasse. Because he's a bit older, and because he also, I think, was very sure of his place in the government, Prime Minister Katsura actually reaches out to the emperor and asks him to intervene. So going back to your question before, Tigo, about the emperor and his actual authority, the prime minister asks the emperor to tell the navy to provide a minister, and the emperor does this. So in terms of democracy, right, we're again looking at a situation that's complicated. The navy trying to circumnavigate the process through which the elected officials and the administration that they have chosen, who are not elected, the cabinet, make policy, etc., and then the emperor stepping in from a higher position to then sort of make that demand, to push back on that demand and to make things work and work more smoothly. So this leads to the Taisho riot of 1913. So before we were in December 1912, now we're in 1913. And this is a movement, again, we're talking about this era of popular rights, of rebellions, riots, protests, and some violence as well. In the capital, there develops a movement to protect constitutional government. We have businessmen, journalists, and members of the Imperial Diet, most from the lower house, who see what's happening as problematic. And that, in fact, the military and the emperor and maybe the prime minister, but most likely the military and the emperor can pretty much decide how things are going to function. They can decide how the government's going to run, what's going to get passed, and this is problematic. And they're worried about what that means for democracy in Japan. And the riots spread from Tokyo to Osaka and Kobe and Kyoto. Around 10,000 people across the country. There are, again, arrests. This happens, it also shows us that there is a potential, right, for democracy in Japan, already limited, right, to be circumvented by those in power. So the prime minister suspends the diet 3 times, which is actually kind of a way to avoid having to resign, and then eventually he has to resign. And they bring in Yamamoto Gonohyoi, who is a Navy, a member of the Navy, active member of the Navy, so still an active member of the Navy, to settle things down. But there is never a full resolution to this issue. Like there is never a law passed that will keep these interests, like the Navy or the Army, from pushing the sort of constitutional parliamentary process or the cabinet to act as it wants. Another riot I want to talk about is 1918 rice riots. A very different kind of riot. This is a situation that comes about due to a rise in the prices of rice. So there is a rice shortage, but there's rice in Japan. The issue is the rice is not being shipped from the places where it's grown throughout Japan. It's mostly being shipped to the military. And in several different places, people are seeing, truckloads and train cargo holds full of rice leaving the countryside and going elsewhere. And they're like, what? This is rice that we grow, because we're mostly farmers in this country. Why is rice so expensive, and why are we not able to get rice? And in Toyama Prefecture, which you see here, in a small coastal town, some fisherwomen who saw truckloads of rice going by, they were fed up, and they marched to protest this unfair distribution of rice from the countryside. First, they petitioned the government of the local prefecture to explain and then provide rice. When that failed, they rioted. These riots, again, will become a nationwide problem as well, led in many places by women in the first place, and then they spread to men as well. And we talked about a figure before named Suzuki Bunji, who founded the first Japan's first labor union, and then he is, we talked about that before, he will step in and he will basically try and calm things down and help figure this out. And he'll work with someone named Harake, who is a rising politician, who we'll see in future classes, who seems to be pretty good at trying to get people to agree to things if by offering them small things, he can get things in return. The sort of local government interactions he's able to negotiate are quite impressive. So this will be important for that reason, but we'll see it again later on in the class. And we also begin to see the sort of surging of a newly emerging popular movement, right? A call for more political voice by the people of Japan. We see protests, we see riots happening. So we're going to stick with that a bit more today, but we're going to sort of stay in the same time period before moving forward and see how this story plays out. So we have now more prime ministers, another big list to throw at you. I want to point out some things that are important to see here. We discussed, for example, the Taisho crisis that happened around the cabinet in 1912 and 13 under Prime Minister Saionji Kimochi last class. But I want to point out a few things. The first is that we have this Seiyu Kai here, which is the party that was founded by Ito Hirobumi, and we'll see that more in a second. It's a pretty important element for most of this first period. And again, here in the second period, we also have a new group, a new party that's going to have more influence called the Kenseikai, who we'll also see more prominently in the next decade. I want to talk also about the rise of party politics, which is a kind of a boring phrase. But what it really means is that people elect local and then regional and national members of their parties to positions of legislative authority, and then they actually make the laws, right? This is how democracy is supposed to work in the sort of Euro-American model, the bicameral model. So Japan is doing that, and they have this first political party, the Yukai, which is going to carry this out. So to keep that in mind, the person who really makes this system work for the first time is actually Harake, or whose actual name was Takashi, who really takes the system and makes it work. And we'll talk about this next person in a second. But taking it back to his party, the Rikken Seiyukai, which is translatable as the Party of the Friends of Constitutional Government, is a party that was established in 1901 by the first Prime Minister. But it kind of remains a very elite institution. It's only in the 1960s and 70s when these sort of middle-ranking members of the party begin to take this as a real chance to have more democracy. So this is when Harake, who at this point is sort of a middle-aged but very forward-thinking bureaucrat, becomes home minister. And as home minister, he's in charge of the ministry that handles the affairs happening, the affairs happening in Japan, including things like education as well. So it's under his guidance that this sort of party begins to have more influence. He starts to recruit people from the party who he likes and giving them jobs as governors and as mayors and other, well, not giving it, various jobs in government that they're able to do and carry the name of this party with them if they do so. Bless you. So he begins to sort of develop this sort of following, right? That's more than just a lineage. It's based on people that he thinks will do a good job as party leaders. He also is going to begin this practice of trying to really link things like public works projects for building bridges or roads and to political, to voting. So, you know, quid pro quo kind of political maneuvering. This is a thing that he really initiates. People will vote for him, or they'll vote for people in his party, and in exchange, then they will do things in the diet that will then help their voters. So this is a new thing for Japan to have happening, but it takes really shape under the guidance of Harake or Takashi. So he becomes prime minister in 1918. So, but he's been around for, as you may have seen before, over a decade, behind the scenes in many ways. So his cabinet right away is made up of members of his party. It's the first time we have a party cabinet, where they're all taken from people who belong to this party, all the different ministers. He also becomes the first prime minister to not come from the aristocracy, be it the court or the military aristocracy. So a lot of firsts happening under him. He's popular because he's able to find ways to end the increasing agitation amongst Japan's working class. We talked about the rice riots, talked about the Hibiya riots, and in between we also talked, I think, very briefly about the Ashio copper mine struggle. He, at each of those, in each of these, the second two at least, of these events is instrumental in bringing these events to a relatively peaceful conclusion and finding a way to negotiate with the masses, so to speak. So it is in that he becomes increasingly respected. He is assassinated in 1921, puts an end to what probably would have been a very, very long career as prime minister, with several more times. But this does lead to the prevalence of party governments for Japan, which is, we can sort of say, is equivalent to having more democracy. As we will see, though, going back to our map here, our list here, the people who take charge after him are increasingly not going to come from the party system. And we'll only see the party is going to come back into power. So we'll talk about what happens here in the middle a bit as we go on today, and why we have the military and the Privy Council chairman being named to the prime minister position in Japan. I want to talk about three trends that are sort of continuations of this momentum amongst the working classes and amongst, I guess, Japan's population as a whole, that are I think, overall pushing for more democracy, more political involvement and political power for the masses of Japan. Let's talk first of all about feminism. As you may recall, the legislation of the late 1800s in Japan is very clearly against women being able to vote or to have a role in political assemblies or speak at those assemblies. The 1899 Meiji Civil Code classifies women along with criminals and the insane as sort of semi-humans or semi-people, and therefore in need of caretakers. So they're not in a situation here of empowerment, despite things that are happening that are empowering them off of the sort of the law books. I'll talk about a figure here to illustrate what's happening, though, because things are going to begin to change around the turn of the 20th century. Hiratsuka Daicho is, she was a woman born into a low-ranking samurai family, but she grows up after all this has already come to pass, the revolution, and so she is very intelligent. She goes to very good school, Japan's first college for women. She goes to that school, and she's very interested in the idea of womanhood and the cause of women's rights and liberation. And so she, as a journalist and then as an author, decides to start her own journal called Blue Stocking, or in Japanese, Seito. And this is it's a literary magazine, and it's for women, but also written by women. And this is in contrast to to a handful of male-edited publications that do sometimes feature men talking about women, and occasionally women also get to be involved. It's a women's literary magazine, and it is by definition controversial. She wants to take on these major themes that she sees and is reading about in English and Japanese that are like the most important events happening of the day. She will be joined as a sort of editorial assistant or by a woman named we'll see her more in a second, but as another woman journalist, author Itonoe as well, after the first couple of years on this journal. So this is going to be an important sort of couple to remember. But anyway, I want to give you a sense of what the goal of this journal was. So I'm going to show you now the prologue to the first issue of Blue Stocking. Okay, so what is this author mean when she writes in the beginning, woman was the sun? What is Hiratsuka Raicho talking about? This declaration. In the beginning, woman was the sun. See hands creeping up. Wesley, yeah?
For a lot of patriarchal policies and standards.
Okay, so it has a very real, like, practical application, right? That before the patriarchy was established, women were powerful. It does mean that, definitely. It also, though, talks about another precedent that I think reflects that reality as well. Any ideas who might be, of what might be being referred to here? Woman, sun, Japan, mythology. Any? Michelle?
The sun goddess was a woman.
Sun goddess, right? So this is all about the imagery and the mythology of the sun goddess Amaterasu. So, and this, as you said, right, Wesley reflects a time when there was, in fact, a system that allowed women to be powerful and impactful. But now they are the moon. So this is her journal's sort of opening salvo, and it's what sets the tone for this journal. And it will discuss things of interest to women, but also to women's place in society. We can see that these themes are going to keep growing. As you may have seen from the slide before, the journal is closed in 1916 for reasons mostly of censorship, because it is taking on these controversial topics, but the thread kind of continues to grow. So she will also be the key member, the key leader of founding the New Women's Association in 1920, of which the goal is to take on these issues in a more pragmatic way, beyond the world of literature and speeches. She's joined by a younger protege named Ichikawa Fusae, who we might see more in class if we have time, a very important member of Japan's post-war political system. They are calling for women's suffrage. They're calling for liberation of women from all of these legal and cultural boundary sort of constraints. And they are able to, in a very political way, get signers of petitions that eventually will lead to a nationwide petition against Article 5. Article 5 of the 1900 Peace Police Law, which echoes previous ordinances that prohibit women from being able to attend or take part in political events. That's what they're calling for, is women being able to hopefully vote, but at least to not be even barred from attending or being involved in politics. This is part of a larger groundswell happening beyond this sort of really educated elite slither here of society, and I want to just sort of take a bit of a side. I want to take a little bit of a tangent here and discuss that a little bit. So, what we're seeing here, and part of why her new club is called the New Woman Association, is there is in fact this idea of the new woman in Japan, and it really does differ dramatically from the womanhood that was being described before in Japan society, even before 1900. The woman being increasingly shown in advertising, in stories that are being written by authors, novels, etc., is a well-educated woman that belongs to this sort of special class, and the new woman is visually defined by the way she dresses in Japan. So this would means like wearing pants. It means wearing Western style makeup. It means these kind of visual signals of Western style womanhood. But it also means education, and it also means employment. So women are having, for the first time in Japan, from about 1904, we see this growing number of women who are working as journalists or as nurses, as doctors, teachers, as well as in the world of secretaries and store clerks and cafe waitresses. So this might not seem like it's revolutionary, but if we think about women as not having had wage labor in the public sphere before in Japan as a whole, this is actually quite revolutionary. And this is happening. And this is a trend that the New Woman Association and other groups are trying to promote. And it's important to keep that in mind. We can talk about this whole group of women here as part of this sort of the new middle class of women as the Moda Ngaru, or the Moga group. So when you would see a woman who was dressed in Western clothing and was pretty fashionable, you might point and say, that's a Moga, right? And I'm not quite there yet, but maybe I aspire to be that. So it was really an amazing time, actually, I think, for women like that in Japan. I think, let's see, we'll do it. What also happens is that the world of mass media, as well as Japan's government, are realizing around 1910, 15 that this literate, working, ambitious body of women in Japan are an untapped resource. And after a lot of discourse, a lot of talking about women being important to Japan becoming a modern country in the 19th century, there's a bit of a lull. But it does pick up again in the 1910s, where the government realizes that they have this sort of captive audience that they can then also talk to and give instructions about how to be a good citizen, how to be a good mother, these kinds of messages. And also, the world of mass media realizes that women also are doing a lot of the buying and the financial household management happening in Japan, and that selling requires talking to them. So there's a shift in Japanese mass media to really take women as the reader very seriously. The big 4 women's magazines that come out in this decade, from Fujin Sekai, which is established in 1906, down to Fujin Kurabu in 1920, these are mass circulation magazines, kind of at the very beginning of this movement, for women and filled with things by women, but they're not all necessarily run by women, because as I said before, men are also very interested in finding ways to get information to women through these kinds of publications. Here we have a woman who's steaming rice, and this is an image coming from Shufu no Tomo, which was a magazine founded by, I'll get there in a second, Ishikawa Takayoshi, who was not a woman himself, but who really believed that a magazine was a great way to encourage the right kind of motherhood and womanhood. He also was a Japanese Protestant Christian. He's in my own work. But we see that he's trying to share information about household management, about raising children, about these kinds of things as part of a model of womanhood. And then a lot of the recipes that come in, or the dress cutting, like shapes, all these things are going to be actually promoted in these magazines by women themselves who are interested in the same kind of exchange. So women actually, as an audience, are going to explode, so to speak, and become a target audience for these cheap magazines. Let's move now to thinking about democracy, because part of what's happening is that advertising and sort of publications are more democratic, they're more geared towards a larger and larger public. That happens. We also talked about a bit about politics and how that was also going to be changing. We talked about the riots, these elements as well. So let's talk now about the idea of democracy in Japan. It was complex because we have a constitution that leaves some things a little bit ambiguous, as we discussed a few weeks ago. So I want to focus on a key idea within the Japanese sort of the dominant Japanese democratic ideal of the time. Yoshino Sakuzo was a professor at the Tokyo Imperial University, which is the premier university in Japan. It is the public university, but the premier school in Japan at this time. It's the first Imperial University. And he teaches in the department on the faculty of law. He writes many different kinds of articles, but he's focused especially on the idea of democracy and what that means in Japan in this context. On the Union Constitutional Government in 1916, he publishes this idea of popular democracy, or minpon shugi, which he himself, being very influenced by Christianity, by living in the West, by living also in China for a while as well, he defines this as a government that is that restrains the power of the oligarchy or of the monarchy within the confines, right, of a constitution. Ideally, it would need to have universal suffrage. Do you guys recall how many people can vote in Japan, or what Japan's voting percentage is at this time? Yeah, right? 2%, right? So not much at all. He's very much against that, wants to see this changing. The army should be controlled by the population of civilians, not by the emperor or by even the diet. Again, makes you think about that. And the diet should be popularly elected. It should not be appointed at all. These ideas they might seem, I don't know, to contradict a little bit the ideas of the Constitution of the Empire of Japan. Although until 1925-26, this pretty popular way of framing the Constitution's content and of pushing for a bit more democratic system was very much mainstream. It was not radical in it by any means. So just keep that in mind. We'll come back to him a bit more in our discussion. His students, impressionable young minds at the nation's top university, they found his ideas to be convincing, and they actually, I'm missing a character, Minpon Shugi, but and they create a youth society that's based around the ideas of egalitarianism and of helping others and on social reform that was very influential. Many of his students go on to become leaders in other more radical movements that we'll get to in a second. Across the hall at the Imperial University, there was his colleague, Minobe Tatsukichi, who you see here, also professor at the Imperial University, also in the Faculty of Law. He actually was the director of that faculty. Eventually, he becomes a member of the Diet. That's later on. His writing, in fact, even preceding the writings of Yoshino Sakuzo, put forth an idea of the organ theory. The organ theory is essentially that Japan is like a human body, and that all of the pieces of the body are part of the body, even the emperor. So the national body, or the polity, or the kokutai, was the most important thing. And that the emperor was the head of the government and the actual head of this body, and that the people are all organs of the state. And this should be that the emperor was still just one organ of the state. And it talks about the upper and lower houses of the diet, and it talks about the arms and the legs, all these different pieces. But the idea is that the emperor and the national polity are not the same thing. The emperor is just part of the national polity along with everybody else in Japan. Again, an idea that could be revolutionary, but that up until the 1926-ish period was a mainstream political concept. It was not censored, it was not forbidden. He gave talks on this all over the country. It was published in the top journals of the time. So keep that in mind as well. Another trend that we see is a trend away from democracy and towards more radical political configurations, most important of which would be socialism. So let's go there next. I'm going to use the term socialism because there are actually several different kinds of socialism happening this time in Japan. Let's talk first of all about Kotoku Shusui here. He is a a writer and a journalist and an activist, very much at the ground level in the turn of the century world of anarchist socialism. He speaks with people like Peter Kropotkin in Russia at the time, who are advocating a radical shift through anarchy to arrive at socialism. So he is advocating for this in Japan very strongly. He does some translation work as well, but he's mostly just an activist. He also creates a paper called the Heimin Shinbun, or the Commerce News, which is the premier sort of anarchist / socialist paper in Japan at that time. As you can imagine, the emperor system does not really match up very well with anarchy, right? In fact, it's actually the opposite. And it also doesn't work well with the idea of having a socialist structure of government. So you can imagine how that's going to go. Obviously, he was a controversial figure. His paper was shut down every few months. He had to restart it, reapply to restart it, and apologize. But he kept doing this and became a mentor to thousands of very influential political agitators and thinkers, many of whom actually also in the post-war period will come back and be important in Japan's government and leadership. A friend and colleague of Kotoku Shusui was Osugi Sakai, who was more radical. He was more interested in action than writing about things, right? He was promoting the idea of trying to attack authority and create and actually bring about a situation of anarchy that would then lead to socialism. He also was very involved in translating the works of people like Kropotkin into Japanese and to popularize them as well. And he also wrote for and worked on this same Heimin Shinbun, the same paper. Osugi Sakai. Osugi Sakai's partner, girlfriend, Itonoe, became increasingly radical and was radically feminist, and even more so, I would say, than her friend and the editor of, her co-editor of the journal Bluestocking. She wrote and spoke a lot about the right to abortion, prostitution, and its ills as a legal thing for Japan society, motherhood as well, those kind of things. She was against arranged marriage, and she was very often banned from writing things. And she was the person in charge of the Bluestocking magazine when it was shut down. So she is a very powerful figure in that sense as well. But then as she gets into the 1920s, is going to be writing more and more openly about radical socialism and anarchism as well, and bringing also more women's voice into that movement in Japan. So another key figure we have here in that movement as well. So all these figures, they are big names, but they're also part of a movement across the sort of Japan's educated elite to investigate socialism. Socialism. It actually goes back a bit further. So socialism actually has been getting more attention in Japan since about 1895 or maybe 1896 with the end of the First Sino-Japanese War. I talked a second ago about Kotoku Shusui, the founder of the Heimin Shinbun, but also Christians like Abe Iso and Katayama Sen, who study abroad in the West and live a long period of time actually in Europe and the United States, are going to come back and they're going to begin talking about socialism as a concept before there ever is really a party. So we have the Shakai Shugi Kenkyukai that's formed in 1896, and then we have in sort of collaboration with them, and there's also the creation of Japan's sort of first labor society. Not quite a union yet, that happens in 1912, as I mentioned maybe a couple classes ago, but it's sort of the ball gets rolling in 1897. Japan's first socialist party is established in 1901, the SDP, but is right away, using the peace police law, disbanded by the police. if we fast forward again to what's happening in the next 20 or so years, we see that there are efforts again and again to try and allow socialism to be part of the national discussion, and this effort continues to fail. The Socialist Party was founded in 1906. It lasts for a year and it's shut down. And it's only in 22, after many things have changed, after a few government shifts have happened, that the Communist Party of Japan is established, and it does exist from then until today. Behind this movement are the person on the top right, Arahata Kanson, who, well, I'll skip that. And then Yamakama Hitoshi, who are both people who worked on the Heimin Shinbun, who are both inspired by and interested in ideas of Kotoku Shisui, and who really pushed this whole movement forward. Japan's first May Day happens in 1920 on May Day as part of an international call for socialist awareness, right? And awareness also of the peoples who are suppressed and oppressed in the world. So this is all happening, and it's all part of this larger movement that's happening in Japan. We have calls for democracy amongst sort of the more moderates, like I mentioned a second ago. We have calls for radical, more egalitarian societies from socialists. We have feminists calling for more women's rights and the rights to vote and to be part of the world of politics. And I'm going to talk about one last form also here of socialism to finish off this section. This is the socialism of Kita-Iki, who is an interesting figure, not from the same group as the others, but he draws from these different groups, from the democracy group, the socialist group, as well as other groups as well. His 1919, A Plan for Japan's Reorganization, is actually a mixture of right-wing thought with socialism. And it does, again, borrow a bit from anarchism, but it reverses things so that, in fact, it will be a military intervention that will take over the government and then institute national socialism, which now we know can be translatable as Nazism or fascism. And his ultimate goal here is to unite Japan's emperor with the people. So he's actually rebelling against Japan's far right, those who are in the elite of the far right, but his ideas align with their ideas quite a bit, in fact. And he hopes to eventually use this ideology to save Japan from to save all of Asia from Western imperialism. So this is a big victory for all those on the left who are trying to create more political representation and participation as well. Right? You all have sensed that the government of Japan is not a progressive institution. It does not seek to make everyone happy, to have all the population of Japan free to take part in government. This is a fear that they have carried. Meiji oligarchs, who are mostly now have passed on, but that they have nurtured this worry about the masses, right? And this is not a Japanese phenomenon. This is actually common to many Western countries as well. Giving too much freedom to the people when they aren't ready can lead to, in their view, right, a poor understanding of democracy and the ease of being swayed by people who are demagogues, people who are persuasive and populist, and people who are not actually that smart. That's the big fear, right? So, on the same day, after they publish, after the Diet's two houses passed the male suffrage law, they also pass peace police law. Just so we're clear. And there's this idea here of altering the kokutai. And talk about muddy language, right? Any ideology or idea presented that could be interpreted as wanting to change the national polity, or the kokutai just means the national body. That's what the characters mean, right? Could be interpreted as illegal, but also punishable. And a part of that, they link this with private property. So they're really talking about those who might be in favor of these various socialist or Marxist approaches to governance, and they're targeting them. But it goes beyond that, right? And we're going to see this used again and again, right, to try and interpret the acts of people who are at that point in time politically dissident, as seditious, as unpatriotic, as even treacherous.